much for your concise and insightful presentations, and I think now we could go straight to questions and answers. Please identify yourselves and your affiliation, if any. Adrian?
I'm Adrian Karmazyn.
Hi, I'm Adrian Karmazyn with Voice of America, and my question is to Ambassador Pfeiffer. I was very interested in what you mentioned about your recent visit to Moscow and how the think tank community was promoting this idea of a big deal. And so what does that mean about the Russian think tank community? It sounds very imperialistic or not very interested in the spread of democracy or European standards. Is that a troubling issue for civil society in Russia?
Well, I'm not sure. We met with about 20 representatives of the think tank community. I'm not sure if it's appropriate to draw conclusions about all of Russia based on these conversations. But it did strike, I think, a number of the Americans as a bit odd. I mean, it was phrased in the following way. America has vital interests. The vital interest in winning in Afghanistan, not allowing the return of the Taliban. A vital interest in preventing Iran from acquiring any nuclear weapons. A vital interest in preventing North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, oddly, those were not described as Russian interests. I would also see that maybe there's a stronger American interest there, but there certainly is a Russian interest in having a non-nuclear North Korea, non-nuclear Iran, and having success in Afghanistan. I mean, if Afghanistan fails and the Taliban come back, they dislike Russia every bit as much as they dislike the United States. But in this construct, in this program, those were all defined as vital American interests. And Russia would help America solve those American vital interests if America would cede to the Russian vital interest on the post-Soviet space. And it was an interesting discussion because there were some members in the American delegation who I think, quite frankly, would argue that the idea of NATO enlargement going back to the 1990s was probably ill-advised. However, there was unanimity on the American side that the idea of trying to get a Russian veto of these things was just a total non-starter. So I guess we're a bit puzzled by the discussion and by the intensity with which they held to that view. The interesting thing, though, was in several meetings with senior Russian officials from the foreign ministry and from the presidential administration, we did not hear that sort of bargain. I mean, they were talking in much more practical terms about doing the sorts of steps which we saw come out of the meeting between the presidents yesterday that would begin in a pragmatic way to move the relationship forward.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that Andy. We have two Andys here. All right.
Okay, I'm sorry, Andy. I'll pass it. Andy Billick, formerly of McFadden Associates. I said that for Mr. Taylor, who I met with at that time, and currently a consultant specializing in helping companies respond to RFPs. This morning, I found a Reuters article, a short one, saying, headline says, Obama vows take Russia views into account according to a Putin aide. The aide is Yuri Ushakov, and he said they spoke about Georgia, they spoke about Ukraine, and generally about the post-Soviet era. The U.S. president promised to take into account the peculiarities of our relations with these countries. That goes a little bit like they're backtracking. They're trying to make the news on this. It goes in terms of involving Ukraine and Georgia from the Russian point of view, and that they're saying that Obama agreed to take that into consideration. And you all said something a little differently, both of you, and so I'm just curious to your reaction to this Reuters story.
Sure. Well, first of all, we have to consider the source. Second of all, there will be interpretations by aides, probably on both sides of discussions. Third, certainly the United States is going to take into account Russian views on a whole range of issues. The Ukrainians take into account Russian views and American views and other views on a whole range of issues. But finally, I think it's very clear that in order for a U.S. relationship with the Russians to succeed, our strength of support for Ukraine must be clear. And I think that has come across. And I think that's another zero sum that they have avoided. That is, it's possible to have non-zero sum discussions between Americans and Russians and Americans and Ukrainians. It's not at the expense of Ukrainians that we're having these conversations with the Russians. Certainly we're going to take into consideration views of big countries. But I didn't sense that was a backtracking.
Yeah, I would just add as an example, I mean, I think there has been an effort to take account of Russian concerns in the past, and I'd go back to the initial decision by NATO to enlarge. When that decision was taken, and the idea was that it would be a decision between NATO and the country invited, but NATO also understood that Russia had legitimate security concerns. So you had back in 1997 an announcement by NATO of what became known as the three no's, that there was no intention, no plan, no requirement to place nuclear weapons on the territory of new NATO members. There were also commitments made by NATO with regards to not deploying substantial additional combat forces on the territory of new members. So part of it was saying, yes, this country has a right to be in NATO, but also saying that we understand Russia may have some security concerns, and we'll try to find a way to address those. So I don't see anything inconsistent between what the President said and what Ambassador Ushakov said.